Building a castle wasn't like putting together a simple wooden shelf. There were no do-overs, and a single mistake didn't mean a wobbly structure, but several tons of stone collapsing on your skull. Kings learned this the hard way, usually right after someone confidently declared, that should hold. Medieval kings were the original property experts, and they weren't just looking for good school districts. When it came to building castles, picking the right spot was like a deadly serious game of Monopoly. Get it wrong, and you might lose more than just your money. Kings couldn't just point at a map and say, "Put my castle there." They needed a spot that would keep them safe, well-supplied, and powerful. It's like choosing where to sit in a classroom. You want to see everything that's going on, have easy access to the door, and maybe be close enough to borrow a pencil when you need one. Except instead of pencils, we're talking about protecting yourself from armies trying to kill you. High ground was the medieval equivalent of penthouse living. From up high, you could spot enemies coming from miles away, giving you plenty of time to prepare your defenses. Plus, attacking uphill is exhausting. Try running up a steep hill while carrying heavy weapons and armor. I once tried hiking uphill with just a backpack, and I felt like I was dying. Now, imagine doing that while people are shooting arrows at you. Water sources were crucial too. Medieval kings weren't just thinking about staying hydrated, although that was important. Rivers and lakes acted like natural moats, making it harder for enemies to attack. They also provided fresh water for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Because trust me, nobody wants to live in a castle that smells like unwashed socks. Recent archaeological studies have shown that some castles had ingenious water management systems, including underground cisterns that could store enough water to support hundreds of people for months during a siege. Being close to major roads and trade routes was like having your castle next to a medieval highway. You needed supplies coming in regularly: food, weapons, building materials, and all the other stuff that keeps a castle running. It's similar to how modern cities grow around major transportation routes, except instead of Amazon deliveries, you're getting cartloads of grain and iron. Sometimes the perfect spot for a castle already had people living there. Imagine having to tell a whole village, "Hey, sorry folks, but the king wants this hill for his new castle. Time to pack up and move." It's like when your older sibling claims the best spot on the couch, except on a much larger scale. Historical records showed that some medieval kings would relocate entire communities of up to 1,000 people just to build their castles. Talk about an extreme version of eminent domain. And get this, sometimes they'd even move entire churches. Imagine trying to explain that one to the Pope. "Yes, Your Holiness, we're just repositioning your church. No big deal." The process of securing the perfect location wasn't just about the physical aspects. Kings had to navigate a complex web of politics, property rights, and feudal obligations. It was like playing chess, Risk, and SimCity all at once. One wrong move could start a war or trigger a peasant revolt. In fact, there are documented cases of castle construction projects being abandoned halfway through because of political disputes. Medieval construction projects gone wrong. Sometimes kings would try to sweeten the deal for displaced locals. They might offer alternative land, tax breaks, or other perks. It's like when your parents buy you ice cream after making you clean your room. Except the room is your entire village, and the ice cream is, well, probably still not worth it. One particularly clever king in the 12th century offered lifetime positions in his castle staff to the leaders of a displaced village. Talk about a medieval career change. The really smart kings would pick spots that had symbolic meaning too. Building a castle on the site of an ancient battlefield or holy ground was like medieval PR. It sent a message about power and legitimacy. It's similar to how modern politicians love to make speeches at historic locations, but with more dungeons and drawbridges. Some castles were even built on sites that had local legends or myths attached to them, adding an extra layer of supernatural intimidation to their already imposing presence. Defensive considerations could get pretty creative too. Some kings would choose locations that looked terrible at first glance, but had hidden advantages, like building near a swamp. Sure, it smelled bad, but try moving siege equipment through marshland. One famous castle in Wales was built with 3 sides facing steep cliffs, making it practically impossible to attack from those directions. Talk about working smarter, not harder. Some castle locations were chosen based on astronomical alignments. Certain medieval builders would position castles so that the sun would shine directly through specific windows on important dates, like the king's birthday or religious festivals. Medieval bling at its finest. Of course, once you finally pick the perfect spot, you've only solved the first piece of the puzzle. Now comes the really fun part, gathering all the materials needed to build this massive stone fortress. And when I say fun, I mean a logistical nightmare that would make modern construction projects look like building with Legos. Just imagine trying to move thousands of tons of stone without trucks, cranes, or even proper roads. In fact, the amount of stone needed for a typical castle's foundation alone could fill about 50 modern swimming pools. And that's just the beginning of the material gathering adventure. You'd think it would be as simple as ordering from medieval Amazon Prime, but no such luck. We're talking about moving thousands of tons of stone without trucks, cranes, or even decent roads. Makes you appreciate modern construction equipment, doesn't it? Let's talk numbers for a second. A typical medium-sized castle needed about 12,000 tons of stone. To put that in perspective, that's the weight of about 2,000 elephants. The biggest castles could use up to 50,000 tons, basically a small mountain's worth of rock. And you thought moving your couch was hard. Recent archaeological studies have shown that some of the larger castles in Wales use stone blocks weighing up to 1.5 tons each. That's heavier than a modern car. The closest quarry wasn't always next door either. Sometimes the good stone was miles away, which meant organizing the medieval equivalent of a cross-country moving company. They'd create temporary wooden roads just to handle the weight of the stone blocks. These roads were actually pretty clever. They'd lay down thick wooden planks and regularly replace them as they wore out. Kind of like a medieval version of highway maintenance, except instead of orange cones, they probably just had a guy with a flag saying, "Hey, watch out for the giant rocks." Transportation was a whole circus act in itself. Oxen were the medieval equivalent of semi-trucks, except way slower and with more attitude problems. A team of oxen could pull about 2 tons of stone at once, moving at the blazing speed of 2 miles per hour. At that rate, if the quarry was 10 miles away, you'd spend an entire day just making one round trip. Records from one castle build show they needed 200 oxen working continuously for 3 years just to transport the stone. Some clever builders used rivers when they could. Floating stone downstream on barges was like the medieval version of prime shipping, faster and easier than land transport. Of course, this only worked if you were lucky enough to have a river between your quarry and your building site. Otherwise, it was back to the Oxen Express. But stone wasn't the only material they needed. Wood was just as important, and they needed tons of it. They'd use it for scaffolding, roofs, doors, and temporary structures during construction. Records from one castle build show they used over 3,000 trees just for scaffolding. Imagine being the guy in charge of counting all those trees. Medieval deforestation was so severe that some areas of England still haven't fully recovered their woodland 800 years later. The wood situation got so bad in some areas that they had special laws about cutting down trees. Some kings would actually declare entire forests off limits to everyone except castle builders. Breaking these laws could get you in serious trouble, like spend the rest of your life in the dungeon you helped build kind of trouble. Then there was the issue of skilled labor. Master stonemasons were like the rock stars of the medieval construction world. Kings would actually fight over the best builders, offering them special privileges and fat paychecks. Some masons became so famous they could demand ridiculous perks. One master mason reportedly insisted on being paid partly in wine, specifying exactly which vineyards it had to come from. Talk about medieval workplace benefits. The actual workforce was massive. Historical records show that some castle builds employed over 1,000 workers at peak construction. You had specialized stonecutters, carpenters, blacksmiths, and general laborers. Each group had their own guild rules, pay scales, and working conditions. Managing all these workers was like herding cats, if cats wore medieval work boots and argued about lunch breaks. Speaking of workers, let's talk about the unsung heroes of castle construction, the rope makers. These folks literally held everything together. A major castle build could use several miles of rope for hauling stones and operating pulleys. The rope had to be incredibly strong and regularly replaced. One castle's accounts show they went through enough rope in a year to stretch from London to Paris. The most surprising material they used? Iron. They needed tons of it for tools, nails, hinges, and other metalwork. A large castle might use up to 50 tons of iron, and this was at a time when iron was worth its weight in silver. Records from one castle show they used over 50,000 nails just for scaffolding. Imagine being the medieval intern in charge of counting those. Quality control was another headache. Stone blocks had to be cut to exact specifications. Workers developed sophisticated techniques for testing stone quality. Some would even lick the stones to check for impurities. Not the most hygienic method, but hey, whatever works. They also had to check wood for rot and iron for impurities. One wrong material could bring down an entire wall. Finally, there was the storage challenge. Medieval builders had to keep their materials organized and protected from the elements. They built temporary shelters for storing tools and materials, which sometimes ended up being almost as big as the castle itself. It was like having a medieval Home Depot right on site. With all these materials finally gathered and probably a few gray hairs added to the king's head, it was time for the next phase, laying the foundation. Because when you're about to stack thousands of tons of stone into walls and towers, you better make sure they're sitting on something solid. Some castle foundations went so deep they actually hit bedrock. But that's a story for another part of our castle building adventure. With thousands of tons of stone ready to go, thanks to all those oxen we talked about earlier, they couldn't just start stacking rocks and hope for the best. That would be like trying to build a card tower on a wobbly table, entertaining for about 10 seconds, then disastrous. The first step? Digging. Lots and lots of digging. Medieval builders would dig until they hit solid bedrock, which sometimes meant going down 40 feet or more. That's deeper than a 3-story house is tall. Recent archaeological studies of castle ruins have shown that some foundations went even deeper. One castle in Wales had foundations reaching 65 feet below ground. The builders must have felt like they were digging into China. The foundation trenches weren't just filled with regular stone either. They used a medieval version of concrete called mortar, a mix of lime, sand, and water. But sometimes they got creative with the recipe. Some builders added animal blood to their mortar mix because they believed it made it stronger. Others threw in egg whites, hair, and even beer. I guess you could say medieval castles were held together by history's weirdest smoothie. Here's where medieval engineering gets really clever. These builders created what we now call stepped foundations. These looked like giant underground pyramids turned upside down, getting wider as they went deeper. This spread the castle's weight out and made it more stable. One particularly impressive example discovered in Scotland had 7 distinct steps, each perfectly level, all done without modern surveying equipment. Speaking of weird construction techniques, archaeologists have found some strange things in castle foundations. One castle in England had chicken bones deliberately placed in its foundation. Medieval, lucky chicken bones. They've also found coins, religious artifacts, and even shoes. At a castle in France, they found a complete skeleton of a cat, though historians think that was probably more of an accident than a ritual. The actual process of laying the foundation was incredibly precise. Workers would use wooden frames and plumb lines to make sure everything was perfectly straight. If you messed up the alignment at the foundation level, your whole castle would end up looking like a failed game of Jenga. Archaeological evidence shows that some foundations were so precisely laid that they're only off by a few inches over hundreds of feet. Pretty impressive for people working with basic tools. The size of these foundations was mind-boggling. A typical castle foundation could be up to 30 feet thick. That's wider than some modern houses. And they weren't just solid blocks. Builders would create a rubble core by filling the middle with smaller stones and debris, then surrounding it with carefully cut stones on the outside. This technique saved materials and actually made the foundation stronger. Recent studies have shown that this rubble core technique was so effective, it helped some castles survive earthquakes that devastated nearby buildings. Temperature was a huge deal when laying foundations. If it was too hot, the mortar would dry too quickly and crack. Too cold, and it wouldn't set properly at all. Medieval records show builders using some creative solutions to this problem. They'd work at night during summer heat waves and cover fresh mortar with straw in winter to protect it from frost. Some particularly dedicated builders even set up shifts to fan the mortar as it dried. Medieval air conditioning. One of the foundation techniques they used was called continuous pour. They would work around the clock in shifts to make sure the foundation was laid in one continuous piece. This meant organizing hundreds of workers in rotating teams, kind of like a medieval construction relay race. Historical records from one castle build describe workers passing stones hand to hand in human chains stretching hundreds of feet. They even had special whistles and drums to coordinate the workers, a medieval version of a construction site radio. The most impressive part is that many of these foundations are still doing their job today, centuries later. While the castles above them might be in ruins, their foundations are often still perfectly solid. Modern engineers have studied them and found that some medieval foundation techniques were so effective, we still use similar methods today. One castle foundation in Germany was so well built that modern builders decided to construct a new building right on top of it. Talk about recycling. But it wasn't all serious business. Medieval records include some pretty funny foundation-related incidents. One chronicle describes a builder who accidentally embedded his favorite lucky hammer in the foundation mix and spent 3 days trying to dig it out before his supervisor noticed. Another tells of a worker who fell asleep inside a foundation trench and had to be dug out the next morning. Workplace safety standards were a bit different back then. With all that work underground complete and hopefully everyone's lucky charms properly placed, it was time to start on the walls. Because a foundation, no matter how impressive, is just a fancy hole in the ground until you put something on top of it. And medieval castle walls weren't just any walls. They were engineering marvels designed to last centuries and stop armies in their tracks. But building walls that could stand the test of time and warfare, that required some serious medieval ingenuity. Medieval castle walls weren't your average garden walls. Built on those massive foundations we just talked about, these walls had to withstand everything from battering rams to trebuchet attacks. Walls of major castles typically stood between 30 to 45 feet high, taller than a 4-story building. The really serious ones, like Dover Castle, reached up to 80 feet, and they weren't skinny either. Some castle walls were 20 feet thick at the base. You could literally build a small apartment inside them. And sometimes they did. The actual construction process was like a medieval version of a layer cake, except much less tasty. Each layer had its own special purpose. The outer faces used carefully cut stones that fit together like puzzle pieces. These weren't just for looks. Precisely cut stones made the wall stronger and harder to climb. Recent archaeological studies have shown that some master masons could cut stones so precisely that even today you can't slip a credit card between them. Behind these fancy stones came a layer of rougher rocks, and in the middle, that's where things got interesting. The wall's core was filled with a mixture called rubble fill, a medieval builder's secret sauce. They dump in smaller stones, leftover chips from cutting the big blocks, and mix it all with mortar. One castle's records show they even threw in old tools, broken pottery, and once, accidentally, someone's lunch. Archaeologists love finding these middle bits because they're like time capsules of medieval construction sites. Getting those massive stones up high required some clever engineering. They used wooden cranes called windlasses, basically giant medieval elevators powered by people walking inside huge wheels like hamsters in a cage. Historical records show one particularly unlucky worker spent so much time in the wheel that his friends started calling him Sir Hamster. These windlasses could lift stones weighing up to 2 tons, the weight of a modern car. The walls weren't just straight up and down either. Most castle walls were built with a slight slope, wider at the bottom and narrower at the top. This wasn't because medieval builders had bad eyesight. The slope made the wall stronger and helped deflect missiles. One castle wall in Scotland had such a perfect slope that modern engineers still study it today. Tests have shown that stones dropped from the top would consistently bounce off at the perfect angle to hit attackers below. Builders would sometimes build secret passages inside the walls. These weren't just for dramatic escapes. They used them to move supplies, send messages, and even spy on guests in the castle. One castle in France had so many secret passages that a guard got lost in them for 2 days. Modern surveys have found that some castles had up to a mile of hidden passages snaking through their walls. The stones themselves tell interesting stories. Many castle walls still show masons' marks, personal signatures carved by the workers who built them. These weren't just ancient graffiti. Masons used these marks to prove which stones they'd laid so they could get paid. Archaeologists have cataloged over 1,200 different masons' marks from a single castle, each one unique. Some got pretty creative with their marks. One mason in Wales always carved tiny dragons, while another was known for his detailed cats. Temperature changes were a constant headache for wall builders. Stone expands in heat and contracts in cold, which could crack the mortar. Their solution? Built in summer, but only in the early morning and late evening. Medieval records show precise schedules. Work started 1 hour after sunrise, stopped at mid-morning, resumed in late afternoon, and continued until sunset. During one particularly hot summer, a castle in Spain recorded workers only laying stones between midnight and dawn. The most impressive technical achievement? The corners. Cornerstones had to be cut extra precisely because they held everything together. These stones were so valuable that some medieval kings had them carved from special stone quarried hundreds of miles away. Archaeological analysis has shown that some cornerstones weighed up to 3 tons and had to be shaped with accuracy down to a fraction of an inch, all done by hand with basic tools. Speaking of maintenance, they built scaffolding as they went up. But this wasn't your modern metal scaffolding. They used wooden poles stuck through holes in the walls called putlog holes. These holes are still visible in many castles today. One castle in Germany has over 3,000 putlog holes. The medieval builders actually left them there on purpose for future repairs. They even wrote detailed instructions about which holes to use for different repair jobs. Medieval maintenance manuals. The walls also included some clever defensive features. They built arrow loops, narrow slits that archers could shoot through while staying protected. But here's the genius part. These slits were wider on the inside than the outside. This meant defenders could shoot at different angles while presenting a tiny target to attackers. Tests with modern replicas have shown that a medieval archer could cover about 70 degrees of arc through a single arrow loop. With the walls reaching skyward, it was time to think about the castle's real showstoppers, the towers and gatehouse. Because what's scarier than a massive stone wall? A massive stone wall with towers that can rain arrows down on your head. But that's a whole other story of a medieval engineering genius. The real stars of medieval castle defense were the towers and gatehouse, basically the medieval equivalent of a high-tech security system minus the electricity, computers, and everything else that makes modern security actually high-tech. Towers weren't just for show or for princesses to let down their hair. They were serious business. Round towers became the most popular design, and for good reason. Tests on surviving castle ruins have shown that round towers were 50% more likely to survive bombardment than square ones. Plus, there were no corners for attackers to hide in. At one French castle, archaeologists found evidence of an attack where the square tower took heavy damage while its round neighbor remained practically untouched. The tower walls were often thicker than regular castle walls, sometimes reaching up to 20 feet thick. Archaeologists at one Welsh castle discovered that its main tower walls contained over 3,000 tons of stone, enough to build 30 modern houses. The builders had to get creative with the construction process for these massive towers. They actually built them in stages, letting each level settle before adding the next one. One tower took 3 years just to settle properly before they could finish it. They built into towers. The spiral staircases always turned clockwise, going up. This wasn't because medieval builders were obsessed with consistency. It was actually a clever defensive feature. Most people were right-handed, so attackers coming up the stairs would have their sword hand against the center wall, giving them less room to swing. Meanwhile, defenders coming down could swing freely with their right hand. Records show one castle where 20 attackers were held off by just 3 defenders thanks to this staircase design. Speaking of stairs, they weren't all made equal. Some steps were deliberately built at different heights, medieval trip hazards. Defenders knew exactly where these uneven steps were, but attackers would stumble and fall. One castle even had a step nicknamed the Breaker because it was 2 inches higher than all the others. Archaeological studies have found that some of these trap steps were so effective they showed more wear from people falling than from regular use. Now, let's talk about the castle's front door, the gatehouse. This wasn't your average welcome center. Medieval gatehouses were the most heavily defended part of the castle, and for good reason. Historical records show that about 70% of castle attacks focused on the gatehouse. The builders took this threat so seriously that some gatehouses were actually bigger than the castle's main living quarters. The gatehouse had more defensive features than a modern bank vault. First, you had the drawbridge, not just for looks. Modern reconstructions have shown that a typical drawbridge could be raised in under 30 seconds. Then came the portcullis, a heavy metal grate that dropped down like a medieval security shutter. Most gatehouses had two portcullises with a space between them called the killing ground. Records from one castle show that defenders could trap attackers in this space, and, well, let's just say it wasn't called the killing ground for nothing. Some particularly fancy gatehouses even had false entrances, medieval dummy doors designed to trick attackers into wasting time on the wrong target. One castle in England had 3 identical-looking gatehouses, but only one was real. The other 2 led to dead ends filled with those nasty defensive surprises we mentioned earlier. Talk about medieval misdirection. The nasty surprise came from above. Murder holes. These holes in the ceiling let defenders drop all sorts of unpleasant things on attackers. Historical documents list some creative ammunition: rocks, arrows, hot sand, boiling water, beehives, lime powder, and even kitchen waste. One castle's records mention a particularly successful defense where they dropped a beehive on attackers, creating instant chaos. Medieval pest control and castle defense, 2 birds with 1 stone. The towers also housed the castle's early warning system, lookouts. These guys had the highest office in the medieval world, sometimes over 100 feet up. They used a complex system of horns and bells to signal different types of threats. One castle had 12 different horn signals, including specific ones for enemy approaching, someone's trying to steal the sheep again, and the tax collector is coming. Tests on reconstructed tower heights have shown that lookouts could spot approaching armies from up to 5 miles away in good weather. That's about an hour's warning before attackers reach the castle, plenty of time to raise the drawbridge and heat up some defensive boiling water. Some towers even had specially designed acoustic features that could amplify the sound of approaching horses, giving even earlier warnings. With all these defenses in place, you'd think castles would be impossible to capture. But medieval engineers knew that no defense was perfect, which is why they always included one final fallback position: the keep. This was the castle's ultimate panic room, a fortress within a fortress where defenders could hold out even if everything else fell. Unlike modern panic rooms, though, this one was the size of a small apartment building and designed to support hundreds of people for months at a time. If everything else failed and enemies got past the walls, towers, and that nasty gatehouse we just talked about, the keep was where everyone would run to hide. It was like a giant medieval panic room, except instead of lasting a few hours, people could survive in there for months. The keep's walls made regular castle walls look like paper. We're talking about walls up to 40 feet thick at the base. Archaeological studies have shown that some keeps could survive hits from trebuchets throwing rocks weighing as much as a small car. One famous keep took 163 direct hits during a siege and barely got scratched. Modern engineers have calculated that some keep walls could withstand forces equivalent to a modern tank shell. Talk about over-engineering. The entrance to the keep was usually on the 2nd floor, not the ground level. You had to climb up a wooden staircase to get in, and this staircase could be pulled up or burned if enemies got too close. Records from one siege tell us about attackers who finally broke into the castle only to find themselves staring up at the keep's entrance, 20 feet above their heads. Archaeological evidence shows that some keeps even had elaborate systems of counterweights to raise these stairs in under 30 seconds. The inside of the keep wasn't exactly a 5-star hotel. Windows were tiny, more like arrow slits with attitude. Tests on reconstructed keeps have shown that these windows let in about as much light as a cheap flashlight. Kings would actually have servants follow them around with candles during the day. One medieval writer complained that keeps were as dark as a tax collector's heart. Recent studies of medieval documents show that some keeps went through over 1,000 candles per month just for basic lighting. Storage was a big deal in keeps. They had to be ready for long sieges, which meant storing tons of food and supplies. Archaeologists found one keep with storage rooms that could hold enough food for 400 people to survive for 6 months. They kept grain in special pits that were carefully designed to keep out rats and moisture. Some of these storage systems were so effective that archaeologists have found preserved grain in castle ruins that's over 500 years old. The keep's plumbing system was interesting. Most keeps had a garderobe, fancy medieval talk for a toilet. These were basically holes in the wall that dropped everything straight down the outside of the keep. Some castles had up to 30 garderobes stacked on top of each other. Analysis of castle records shows that they actually employed special workers called gong farmers to clean up the mess at the bottom. One castle even paid these workers partly in alcohol, probably necessary for that kind of job. Each floor of the keep had a specific purpose. The ground floor was usually for storage. The second floor held the Great Hall, where the king would meet people and pretend everything smelled fine. Above that were private rooms for the royal family. Recent architectural studies have shown that medieval builders used clever ventilation systems to try to keep the smells from traveling between floors. It didn't always work, but points for trying. The wells often went deeper than modern building foundations. The well at Dover Castle goes down 400 feet. That's deeper than the Statue of Liberty is tall. The workers hit so many problems that the king wrote a letter saying, "If we don't find water soon, we might as well be building a very expensive stone tomb." Modern geologists have studied these wells and found that medieval builders somehow knew exactly where to dig to find water, despite having no modern surveying equipment. The keep's design included some sneaky features too. Many had hidden escape tunnels called sally ports. These tunnels let defenders sneak out during a siege to attack the attackers. Archaeological surveys have found some keeps had entire networks of these tunnels, sometimes stretching for hundreds of yards. One particularly clever design included fake tunnels that would flood if enemies found them. Security wasn't just about thick walls either. Keeps often had sophisticated systems of internal defenses. Each floor could be sealed off from the others, and some keeps even had internal drawbridges between different sections. Castle records show that guards had to learn a complex series of passwords and secret knocks, medieval two-factor authentication. One castle's documents list 24 different secret knocks, each meaning something different. The living arrangements inside the keeps were pretty creative too. Space was limited, so rooms often had multiple purposes. The Great Hall would be a dining room by day and a bedroom for guards by night. Furniture was designed to be easily moved or dismantled. With all these defensive features, supplies, and secret tunnels ready to go, the castle was almost ready for action. But a castle isn't much use without people to defend it and keep it running. The next challenge was figuring out how to make this giant stone fortress actually livable. What turns a giant pile of rocks into a home? That was the big question medieval builders had to answer after finishing all those massive walls, towers, and keeps. Living in a castle wasn't exactly like moving into a modern house. You couldn't just call the power company and turn on the heat. Heating a castle was like trying to warm up a cave, except the cave had windows that didn't close properly. Fireplaces were the answer, and medieval builders went big with them. Really big. Archaeological studies have found castle fireplaces that could hold entire tree trunks. One castle in Scotland had fireplaces so large that a team of servants would drag in 16-foot logs every morning. The king's annual firewood bill was higher than some servants' yearly wages. Tests on reconstructed medieval fireplaces show they could burn through a whole tree in just 2 days during cold weather. Some builders created an early version of central heating. They built hollow spaces in the walls where hot air from the fireplaces could travel up through the castle. Recent studies of castle ruins have found these heating channels in several high-status rooms. Analysis shows these systems could raise room temperatures by about 10 degrees. Not exactly tropical, but better than freezing. One medieval writer praised a castle that was as warm as a baker's oven, though given medieval castle temperatures, that baker probably would have been fired. Water systems were another headache. Sure, they had wells, but getting water to the upper floors was a real workout. Records show that some castles employed water boys, whose only job was carrying buckets up and down stairs all day. One castle's accounts list a payment to a water boy for new shoes every month. Apparently, all those stairs were murder on medieval footwear. Studies estimate that a typical castle needed about 500 gallons of water per day for basic operations. That's a lot of trips up and down those spiral staircases. Rain collection was a popular solution. Medieval builders created elaborate systems of gutters and pipes to catch rainwater and store it in huge tanks. Analysis of one castle's water system showed it could collect enough rainwater in one good storm to supply the castle for a week. The tanks were so well designed that some of them still hold water today. Though you probably wouldn't want to drink from them, 800-year-old rainwater isn't exactly refreshing. Lighting was another fun challenge. Without electricity, castle dwellers relied on a mix of natural light through those tiny windows we mentioned earlier and artificial light from candles and oil lamps. Castle records show mind-boggling numbers of candles being used. One castle went through 8,000 candles in a single month. That's about 260 candles a day, and they weren't the cheap ones from the dollar store. These were high-quality beeswax candles that cost a fortune. The job of chandler, the person in charge of candles, was actually a pretty important position. You did not want to be the guy who let the castle run out of candles. Glass windows were a luxury that would make a modern billionaire blush. Early medieval castles just had wooden shutters, which meant choosing between freezing or sitting in the dark. When glass windows did show up, they were so valuable that some nobles would take them with them when they traveled between castles. Historical records show one queen who traveled with 30 glass windows packed in special cases. Each window could cost as much as a small farm. Talk about expensive house decorating. Castle bathrooms deserve special mention. Besides the garderobes, castles needed ways to keep people clean. Bath time was a major production. Servants had to heat dozens of buckets of water and carry them up several flights of stairs. One castle's records include a complaint from servants about having to carry 40 buckets of hot water for the lady's bath, followed by a note that she found it not warm enough. Archaeological evidence suggests some castles had primitive shower systems, basically buckets with holes that servants would fill with hot water. Medieval spa days were tough on everyone. Storage was a science in itself. Without refrigeration, keeping food fresh required serious planning. Castles had special cold rooms built into their north-facing walls, where temperature studies have shown they could maintain temperatures about 10 degrees cooler than outside. They also had separate rooms for different types of food. One room just for cheese, another for meat, another for grain. One castle's inventory lists 23 different storage rooms, each with its own specific purpose. Modern analysis of these storage systems shows they were surprisingly effective. Some could keep grain fresh for over a year. The kitchen was basically a room designed to be on fire all the time. They were usually built with stone vaults and massive chimneys to handle the heat and smoke from cooking literally all day long. Archaeological evidence shows that some castle kitchens had floors replaced every few years because the constant heat would crack the stones. Temperature reconstruction suggests these kitchens regularly reached over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. One kitchen was nicknamed the Dragon's Den because it was so hot that new servants would often faint on their first day. With all these systems in place to make the castle somewhat livable, there was just one more thing needed: people to defend it. Because a castle without soldiers was just a very expensive stone house waiting to be taken. But medieval military life came with its own unique set of challenges. A castle is only as good as the people defending it. You could have the thickest walls, the tallest towers, and the fanciest murder holes in all of Europe. But without trained soldiers to use them, your castle might as well be made of sand. Medieval military life was no joke. These folks had to be ready for anything from small raids to full-scale sieges. Let's talk numbers for a second. A medium-sized castle typically needed about 100 soldiers for basic defense. During wartime, that number could jump to over 500. Archaeological evidence from one castle showed that the soldiers' quarters were so cramped, each man had about as much personal space as a modern coat closet. Records show one castle commander writing to the king, "The men are packed in like pickled herrings and smell about as fresh." Analysis of castle ruins suggests some soldiers slept in shifts because there wasn't enough space for everyone to lie down at once. Training was constant. Archers practiced every day. Medieval law actually required all men to practice archery on Sundays. Tests with recovered medieval longbows show they required up to 150 pounds of force to draw. That's like trying to lift a grown adult every time you shoot an arrow. Skeletal remains of medieval archers show they developed lopsided bones from years of practice. Their right arms were often 50% larger than their left. Records mention an archer who could hit a target the size of a dinner plate from 200 yards away. The same records also mention he was absolutely unbearable to be around because he wouldn't stop bragging about it. Crossbows changed everything. They were like the medieval equivalent of point-and-click warfare. You didn't need years of training to use one effectively. A few weeks would do it. Modern tests show medieval crossbows could punch through inch-thick oak at 200 yards. They were so powerful that the church actually tried to ban them at one point, calling them too deadly for Christian warfare. Apparently, regular deadly warfare was fine, just not the extra deadly kind. Castle defenders had some pretty creative weapons at their disposal. Besides the usual arrows and spears, they'd use things like caltrops, nasty little spikes designed to stick up no matter how they landed. Archaeological digs have found thousands of these around castle sites. One castle siege ended when attackers had to retreat because their horses kept stepping on caltrops. The defenders had scattered so many that it took 3 months to clean them all up afterwards. Food during a siege was a whole other challenge. Calculations based on medieval records show that feeding 500 defenders required about 900 pounds of food per day. Studies of castle storage rooms show they could hold enough preserved food to feed the entire garrison for up to 6 months. One castle survived a year-long siege by rationing food so strictly that even the lord had to eat the same portions as common soldiers. Castle records list increasingly creative recipes as the siege went on, including leather boot soup and boiled tapestry. Medieval times were rough. Castle defenders had specific jobs that sound pretty strange today. The hobilar was a soldier who rode a small horse around the castle walls, checking for weak spots. The spring-auld master maintained giant crossbow-like machines that could shoot spears the size of small trees. Test reconstructions of spring-aulds show they could launch a 12-foot spear over 300 yards. One castle even had an official dragon tender, though this turned out to be the person in charge of the early warning beacons, not actual dragons. Sleep was a luxury during wartime. Guards worked in 4-hour shifts, and records show they had some creative ways to stay awake. One castle gave its night watchmen special spiced wine that was supposed to keep them alert. Analysis of preserved wine jars suggests this guard wine was mixed with herbs like rosemary and sage, medieval energy drinks. Another made guards carry heavy rocks while on patrol. Getting caught sleeping on duty was serious business. One castle's rules stated that sleeping guards would have to spend the next day wearing their chainmail inside out. Extremely uncomfortable and embarrassing. The most impressive part of castle defense? The coordination. Different groups had to work together like a medieval special forces team. Castle records include detailed defensive manuals. One was 50 pages long and included 20 different trumpet signals for various commands. Archaeological evidence shows they even had backup communication systems using colored flags and mirror signals for when it was too noisy to hear trumpets. A successful siege typically lasted between 6 to 8 months. The longest recorded siege of a medieval castle lasted 21 years. Studies of letters from this siege show that by the end, the attackers and defenders had gotten so used to each other that they would occasionally pause fighting to trade jokes and insults. Some even exchanged Christmas presents, though probably not very nice ones. All these defenses worked pretty well until someone invented gunpowder. Tests on castle walls showed that early cannon fire could do more damage in 1 hour than a traditional siege engine could do in a week. Suddenly, those thick stone walls weren't quite so impressive anymore. But that's a whole different story about how medieval warfare had to completely change when castles stopped being invincible.